Good afternoon and welcome once again to We Got Planning News for You. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Charlie Banner here. As usual, can I encourage you to consider making a charity donation in lieu of a registration fee? Usually we have our preferred charities of Brian May's Save Me, Shelter and the Ukraine Just Giving page. This week we've got a special suggestion which our guest, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, will suggest to you. And on to our guest. We're delighted to have a much longed for landscape episode with Marc van Grieken, the chair of the Landscape Institute's technical committee, and also who sat on the committee that was responsible for the latest iteration of Glivia, and many other things too. Marc, welcome. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Can you tell us where you're calling from, what, if anything, you're drinking, and tell us a little bit about the charity that you're going to suggest to viewers to donate this week?
I'm calling you from the middle of Perthshire, actually, the most beautiful country in Scotland, and quite a far cry away from where I came from, as you see in the background. It's about half a mile of where I was born. Quite the difference.
Indeed. And tell us a little about the charity that we're going to suggest to viewers to donate this week.
Yeah, well, so I grew up here in the Netherlands, in Chilton Goldfield, the tulips. And 17 years ago in Scotland, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And it is an illness that rather makes us withdraw from society and feeling that we can't do what we used to do anymore. And that's obviously not true. And I just wanted to raise more awareness to this. I obviously hope to keep working as long as possible myself. But one of the keys is to work with researchers. And as part of a support network in the UK, as part of the UK, I'm involved in the Dundee Research Interest Group, and they have a direct link with the top academic institution in biological research in the UK. And what we do with small amounts of money we have is we fund student placements for summer work, promising students, and that helps them be encouraged to go into the field of neurological science. So that's where the money, any money would be go directly without a penny being deducted for admin or whatever. So
thanks very much, Marc. Well, it's a fantastic cause, one close to my heart too. So please, viewers, consider making a donation. Rob, I think, has put the details on our website, and I think his clever tech means that if you're watching on YouTube, a link will come up automatically. Chris is going to lead our discussion with you, Marc, on all things landscape and onshore wind related and much more in the second half of the show. In the meantime, let's introduce the rest of the panel. Mary, you look like you're in town.
Good after. I am in town legal, and since the theme is wonderful flowers, I hope you can see that I've got some pictures here, which local artists actually have from Wimbledon have provided us with, and and I'm drinking water. I've been very good. I've been to too many parties this week, so I'm on the water. But anyway, welcome to the show, Marc, and lovely to see you guys.
Thanks, Mary. Paul, we got a text from you about half an hour ago saying that you're going to once again be doing the show from an MSA. I must say, it's probably easier if you tell us when you're not going to do the show from a roadside facility. Are you on the hourly rate again today?
This is the same hotel at what I am now confident to say is Norton Keynes service area on the M6 toll. I was wrong last time round. And Marc's topic challenged me in terms of what I would do for flowers. So initially I thought I would be stuck with this, which is from W.H. Smith's Gardener's World. However, it turns out that Brummies are a romantic lot. So I was able to buy this from the spa. Cheers, Charlie.
Cheers, Paul. Sash, how are you?
I'm in London, I'm in Landmark, and I'm on my way to Lord's to hopefully see a successful Middlesex evening.
Lovely.
Come on, Surrey. Come on, Surrey.
It's at Essex, actually, tonight.
Nevertheless, come on, Surrey.
Chris, presumption's looking very florid there.
Yeah, well, it said flowers. We are a romantic lot, as promised. You know, there's always flowers in this house for Mrs. Young, and presumption's got those. I've had a great week. I went to see UB40 at Blenheim Palace on Sunday night. That was amazing. Hoping to see Ed Sheeran on Saturday, although it's a rail strike. That's not going to be easy. I couldn't find a beer with any flowers in it. This is the next thing. I've been meaning to drink this for a while. It's a beer called Sweet Child of Pine. So I'm
Very
looking forward
good.
to that. And obviously looking forward to the interview with Mark, where I'm going to be interviewing Mark about Dutch cricket.
Cheers, Chris. Well, Charlie Banner here. Actually, I shouldn't really be drinking anything because I've had a fever. I have terrible fever overnight, so I've been on the painkillers, Nurofen, all evening. But anyway, enough man flu, self pity. Blossom Hill. See what I did there? The world's most ubiquitous cheap rosé. So that's what I'll be looking at. I'm not sure I'm up for drinking it, but there we are. And I even got liberty of getting a bunch of flowers. There we are. How nice is that? Anyway, let's get cracking with the cases before the interview. And we're going to start, Sasha, with you're going to tell us about Island Gas's drilling and testing facility scheme that was considered by the Secretary of State at Ellesmere Port.
I am. Thank you, Charlie. And also, I'm not going to let you get away with the impression that you often buy better wine, because you don't. That's probably the most expensive bottle of wine you've ever bought.
Busted.
I'm going to talk about the Secretary of State's decision in the fracking case in Ellesmere Port. And Bob is going to put it up. This is a decision of the Minister of State for Housing. Now, I'm going to make two comments about the decision. It's a refusal. But I'm going to say, in my judgment, the appellant has had quite a tough deal, frankly, in terms of the substance of the decision and the procedural way this appeal was determined. In substance, this was what was for shale gas, or what is more commonly known as fracking. And frankly, it reflects the current energy policy of this government, previous governments, is a shower of we all know what. Because to have the debate that they had at this inquiry about the approach of planning policy to it is really quite remarkable. But why I say the appellant's been unfair, well, it's been quite harsh on the appellant, because the Secretary of State concludes that the development plan is in accordance with the proposal, then goes on to consider material considerations. And there were effectively three material considerations that the Secretary of State wrestled with. The first was the national policy that apparently supports shale gas, and that was a material consideration, obviously, that supported the conclusion reached. And the Secretary of State only gave that moderate weight. Well, it does beg the question, if you only give moderate weight to your own policy, then that is frankly a bit peculiar. But so that supported the development plan conclusion. Then there were two material considerations that went against the development plan conclusion. One was greenhouse gas emissions, and significant weight was given to that. And the other was the stress and anxiety on the local community. And that was given moderate weight. So you've got development plan in accordance, the shale gas national policy supportive, greenhouse gas emissions no, against it, and stress and anxiety on local community against it, an overall conclusion that planning permission should be refused. Now, as an outsider, not in that appeal, that seems pretty harsh, frankly, as an overall conclusion. Now, I also wanted to raise the point about procedure. Just have a moment. I don't know, Rob, if those who have got more beady-eyed, let's just look at the timeline. I mean, I say this with bitterness because the number of times an inspector say, Mr. White, you said 20 minutes in opening and you've now been 21 minutes. That appeal was made in 2018. The inquiry was January 2019, when I still had resemblance of hair. 7th of June 2000, you look at the first paragraph, 15th of January 2019, the inquiry opens. The inspector, to be fair, submitted the report on the 6th of January 2020, and the decision is the 7th of June 2022. So just have a moment. 30 months it sat in room 101 of the department awaiting a decision. How can that be right in any shape or form to have a delay of that extent? And look at para 1. The application was made on the 20th of July 2017. So, the brilliantly quick and fast and efficient planning system, 5 years to go through the system. So I think, as I said, the appellant was harshly done by, I think, in substance and certainly procedurally. This doesn't reflect well on our planning system when it takes that long to reach a decision on what, on any basis, is a pretty critical component of our energy provision.
And as we know from various other cases, including one noted one of yours, it's unpredictable how long Secretary of State decisions take. It's by no means always 2 years, so somewhat arbitrary.
Well,
Thank goodness it doesn't normally take 2 years.
Quite.
Say in the budget report a couple of years ago, ministers committed to issuing decisions within 3 months of receipt of the inspector's report. 3 months.
Yeah.
Very telling.
Now,
Now,
wasn't it, Chris?
Was that Paul? Were you cross-examining me?
Yeah, no, I just said, I was supporting you, my friend. I was supporting you, my friend. No, that's a very possible commitment, though, isn't it? As I recall.
Yeah, it's a commitment. It's a commitment they haven't kept. But then, you know, imagine that.
Now, on that bombshell, Mary, you're going to tell us about David Wilson's appeal in Charnwood.
I am. So we're going to a place called Silaby, if I've got that pronunciation right, in the borough of Charnwood. Silaby is a service centre, and it's also a place where, because it's a service centre, policy CS1 of the 2015 core strategy sought to provide at least 3,000 homes. There was also an earlier 2004 local plan which had delineated development limits, and the site lay outside the development limits. And you can see the dates. I mean, it's just worth saying, in contrast, this was an application that was dated March 21, refused September 21, appeal decision allowing June 2022. So quite a different time frame to the last matter. But back, if I may, to the story. And Rob, can you put up the plan, please, next? So let's just look at that plan for a moment. You can see there the black and red dotted line, which is delineating the development limits. And you can see, obviously, the site lay outside this. It also, the 2004 plan also identified what was called an area of separation. And the site lay between Silaby to the north and Cossington, just round the corner, as it were, to the south. Thank you very much, Rob. And later, there was a neighbourhood plan which again delineated the limits of the development in pretty much the same way. At the time of the appeal, there was an emerging local plan which had been submitted for examination, but the inspector concluded that carried very little weight. There were several main issues, the first one being the suitability of the location of the site for development. And unsurprisingly, given that policy background, the inspector found that it would be contrary to local and neighbourhood plan policies. But he said, whether or not it's in a suitable location depended on his judgment on the remaining issues. And the next remaining issue was character and appearance. And Rob, can you just put up the statement of common ground? Because it's worth just pointing out that, and if you can go to the next page of that, do you have the second page by any chance up on that, which is the contents of that document? So look at this. This isn't always the case, but in this particular case, there was a statement of common ground dealing with visual matters, as you can see. And you can see in particular, Appendix 1, there were viewpoints, locations, and an inspector's itinerary. And you can see Appendix 2 was a Scotch schedule setting out the summary of effects. So the inspector had there each landscape architect's views on the impacts of the development. Thank you very much, Rob. And so the inspector was clear that the proposal would have a harmful effect on the character and appearance of the area. And although it would reduce the area of landscape separation, it would maintain the separate identities of the settlements. That's because on the plan, there was a red dotted line, and Paul and his clients had cleverly decided to retain the housing in the northern part of the site, thus leaving the southern part of the site free, and thus maintaining the separate identity of the settlements, which is important because it led the inspector to conclude that ultimately, it wasn't a valued landscape. And although there would be some conflict with paragraph 174B of the framework, he gave only moderate harm to the intrinsic character and the beauty of the countryside. So that was his conclusion in relation to landscape. The other issue which I want to talk about is infrastructure provision, because there was a bit of a fight on education and healthcare provision. So this is of some interest. So 170 houses would generate 51 primary school pupils, but the inspector found on the evidence before him, the county council were appearing, that it had not been demonstrated that the development would give rise to a deficit of places. And so that education contribution wasn't necessary, nor was the related bus transport contribution. But the secondary education contribution was necessary, as was the SEND contribution. The early years contribution wasn't found to be necessary. And reading between the lines, what was going on here was that in some instances, the county council were attributing capacity to undetermined planning applications at the time of the appeal. And so, unsurprisingly, you might think, viewers, the inspector took the view that it was unreasonable, effectively, to allocate capacity to undetermined applications in advance of the appeal. In other words, first come, first served, particularly in circumstances where you're dealing with very out-of-date development plans. So that really sorted that issue out. There was also an issue about healthcare provision, and there was a proposal to expand 2 local surgeries. But again, on the evidence, the inspector wasn't convinced that that was necessary in order to enable this development to proceed. And so he ruled that that contribution was not necessary. Went on in the planning balance to give, as I say, a limited amount of weight to the loss of BMV, best, most versatile agricultural land. He thought the drainage could rightly be covered by condition. On the overall planning balance, and this was a crucial point, there was only 3.2-year housing land supply, so we were in Para 11D territory, and ultimately he gave significant weight to the provision of new housing, moderate weight to economic benefits. He gave reasonable weight, whatever that means, I have to say, reasonable weight to the BNG issue. He gave no more than moderate weight to the, as I say, the landscape issue. And so, all in all, he was very clear that in accordance with the presumption in favour of development, planning permission should be granted. So well done to Paul Tucker and Constance Bell, his junior, and in particular also Andy Cook from Pegasus, who was the appellant's landscape witness. And also please Ben Hunter from ERM on education. Well done, Ben. Thanks very much. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. Now, the next 2 cases, Paul and Ryan, is a sort of tale of 2 halves, really, or two contrasting tales, to mix my metaphors, about surveys and about net gain. Compare and contrast. So I'm going to go first with a case, appeal decision from Mansfield District, Inspector Siobhan Watson, considering a proposed development of up to 204 dwellings in a quarry known as Gregory Quarry. And the main issues in the case were the effect of the development on biodiversity, in particular various designations and species, and its effects on designated local green space. And in relation to biodiversity, the inspector found that in various respects, the surveys that had been undertaken had been insufficient, particularly in relation to invertebrates and bats. And the reasoning in relation to bats is of particular note, not least because bats crop up in a number of different contexts, including the next case that Paul's going to cover. And the inspector felt that the on-site, and this is important because in the next case it's off-site, but the on-site surveys in relation to bats were deficient, having regard to the Bat Conservation Trust guidelines. And the guidelines cover, amongst other things, the extent and nature of surveys required. And under those guidelines, there should have been 2 surveys a month through the survey season, April through to October, whereas what had in fact been done had been 4 surveys over April, August, September and October. And the inspector recognised that the BCT guidelines are not mandatory, they're only guidelines, and that professional judgment is required. Indeed, there have been, I think, 3 separate ecology firms acting for the appellant in relation to this case, all of whom had considered the surveys were sufficient. However, at paragraph 18 of the decision, she said that as that activity had originally, in the first ecological survey report, been indicated to be higher than subsequently was recorded in those limited surveys, she considered it would have been prudent to go to the higher level of granularity suggested by the BCT to see if the surveys that had limited surveys been undertaken were outliers as opposed to reflecting the true position. And of course, because this related to surveys for on-site protected species, this engaged the circular guidance 0605, paragraph 99 of which says that only in exceptional circumstances can you have a Grampian style condition precluding commencement or occupation and development until further surveys have been undertaken. Paul's going to deal with the flip side of that in relation to off-site mitigation land in the next case. Then of the other main aspect of interest in this case, it's a very interesting case, generally actually a very sort of nuanced, erudite judgment that really gets into the detail of the ecology issues. But the other aspect of particular interest relates to biodiversity net gain. And at paragraph 31, the inspector set out the current received wisdom in relation to BNG, namely that obviously the Environment Act 2021 requirement for 10% doesn't yet apply because the Act isn't yet in force, but the received wisdom is that the framework requires a measurable increase, albeit one which could be a photo finish improvement as opposed to 10%. I note in passing, this may be relevant to this, actually what paragraph 179B of the framework says is identify and pursue opportunities for securing net measurable gains of biodiversity, not secure net measurable gains, but identify and pursue opportunities for them is actually what the framework says, and that may be significant here. So what the inspector then went on to note is that even on the appellant's case, there was a deficit, there was an 11% net loss in biodiversity on site. Therefore, there needed to be off-site provision in order to deliver a net gain. Off-site provision being something under the Environment Act 2021 is perfectly legitimate. And the Act makes various provision for how that would be secured. But of course, the Act's not yet in force. And the provisions in relation to off-site credits, etc., aren't yet in force either. And at the time of the decision, the council hadn't got any net gain schemes to which Section 106 contributions from this scheme could be put to deliver the net gain. And she said at paragraph 35, I appreciate development can't commence until the council has approved a BNG scheme under the terms of the 106. So the 106 had a sort of Grampian type thing. You can't put a teaspoonful of tar in this quarry until there's a net scheme. A net gain scheme. However, the appellant hasn't identified a habitat bank and the council doesn't have a bank. Therefore, I can't be satisfied that the off-site net gains would be appropriate or in a suitable location, as there's no control over where or when the council might allow it to be provided, no scrutiny over the details. The natural environment might not be left measurably better. Now, pausing there, if it wasn't for the next paragraph, I'd be inclined to think that's a little bit stingy on the appellant because it's not the appellant's fault that the council haven't got a net gain regime for off-site payments. Effectively, the keys were entirely with the council to decide whether or not to allow net off-site net gains, which of course are in principle enshrined in the Environment Act 2021. So until the council gets an off-site bank, then schemes which rely upon off-site net gain can't proceed. And remember, as I said, the framework doesn't say secure measurable net gains, it says pursue opportunities for securing. And couldn't it be said, well, where there are no opportunities because the council hasn't yet got an off-site regime, then there are no opportunities to pursue and therefore there's compliance with the framework. Now, possibly, but at paragraph 36, the inspector refers to a previous appeal decision in Milton Keynes, where the appellant had used the Environment Bank to provide requisite level of biodiversity credits on other sites. So rather than relying on a local authority scheme, it was rather than the Environment Bank scheme. Now, the inspector went on to say in that case, the Environment Bank had been directly approached by those appellants and had provided a quote. In this case, no such discussions had taken place. Therefore, that decision isn't directly comparable. So it seems to me that really what the inspector was finding in substance is that there was a further opportunity that the appellant in that case hadn't pursued within the meaning of 179B, which is opposed to the local authority-led off-siting. There was the Environment Bank-led off-siting. Had they pursued that, and had that not been possible, it would seem to me that under 179B of the framework, it could be said, well, they've done all they reasonably could. They pursued the opportunities. There are no opportunities. But they left a particular stone unturned, and that's what did them for them on net gain. So it seems to me that until the Environment Act 2021 regime is in force, when all this is going to be on a statutory footing and it'll be much easier to administer, in this shadow policy-based net gain regime, pending the 2021 Act coming into force, it's important for developers who need to rely upon off-site credits to look not just to the local authority, but also see if the Environment Bank or a local wildlife trust have appropriate credits which could in due course be purchased. Leave no stone unturned. And if you still can't achieve the net gain after that, then under the framework, I think you should be okay because you've pursued all the opportunities. So anyway, quite an interesting case. And now, Paul, you're going to tell us about another case involving surveys and net gain, amongst other things.
I will indeed, Charlie, and I'm mindful that we need to get on to Mark. So I'm going to give you the highlights and pick out that issue that you've identified specifically. So the highlights are Charlie Banner was acting for the appellant and the appeal was allowed. That's what it says here on a note from Charlie. Apparently, I need to summarise more than that, so I will do. There was an issue. It's a scheme for about 100 houses in North Somerset. Debate between the council and the appellant as to whether there's a 5-year land supply. It was 3.2 as against 5.6. Decision of Mr. Inspector Stevens, who does a review of what you do in relation to deliverability when assessing sites, which I commend to anybody looking at 5-year land supply issues. But he found that there wasn't a 5-year land supply. So that argument was successful. There were other issues, spatial strategy. The BNG in that case was 56% and a massive 103% net gain in relation to spatial. So big BNG net gain. But the issue that Charlie's focused on, which is certainly an issue I was going to explain, is the argument there was that the council was saying that if it's possible to get on-site mitigation on-site, then you should refuse it if part of your mitigation is off-site. In that case, you could only get about 2/3 on-site and 1/3 was proposed off-site with a biodiversity habitat plan. And the inspector pretty robustly said that the council were reading things into the guidance that just weren't there. And indeed, Charlie refers to my Milton Keynes case from year before last, where we proposed things and that were then identified through the Environment Bank to a non-specific site, but through a specific provider based upon specific criteria. It would be handy if government gave some guidance to indicate that was the right thing to do. But anyway, Charlie won the argument and he was right to do so in that regard. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chris.
Cheers, Paul. Chris, over to you for the interview.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, Mark, and thank you for being very patient through those case reports. We all know a lot more about biodiversity net gain than we did about half an hour ago. Now, can I just introduce you properly, if I may? You're obviously a landscape architect and you're a fellow of the Landscape Institute. You're the chair of the Landscape Institute's technical committee, and any technical guidance notes and information notes full to be considered and issued by your technical committee. You're chair of that committee, a trustee, and on the board of trustees for the Landscape Institute, and you joined the Glivia advisory panel in 2012 at the start of developing and drafting the 3rd edition of the guidelines, which of course we all know as the Glivia or the Purple Book, and you're involved obviously in lots of work that the Landscape Institute does. I wanted to start by just asking what what does the technical committee do?
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I just want to say I'm indeed the chair of the technical committee. What I'm talking about today is my personal opinion in that context, not formally representing the landscapes. The technical committee, Chris, is one of 3 standing committees. We've got technical committee, an education committee, and a policy committee. And obviously they act in areas of work. So the education committee has a lot of relationship with education and training, universities, etc. Policy committee obviously discusses how we might want to influence policy within the country in the interest of landscape. And the technical committee is really aiming to provide technical guidance and information about any aspect we may come into contact with during the execution of our normal job. So this could be to do with impact assessment, guidance for landscape management, or lighting assessment, guidance on lighting, or information on planting, on use of materials, etc. And we offer 2 bits, information notes or guidance notes. And not all of those are exclusively prepared by the members of the Landscape Institute. We work with external agencies and parties too.
Okay, so we have these technical notes. I want to dive straight in with the topic that a lot of people want to talk about, really, with landscape architecture, which is, can you really assess landscape and visual impact objectively?
Absolutely. You need to be properly trained, you need to gain experience, and you need to build up your expertise. It's not a matter of walking out in the countryside, coming back and writing your report. Because landscape, of course, is something that affects all of us, that everybody has something to say about landscape. Not everybody has something to say about geothermal layers or planning policy even, or the law, or anything like that. But landscape, we all have a view about. So the temptation is then to say, well, landscape, if we all have a view, then it doesn't really matter anymore. And indeed, it would be dangerous if we just accepted the positions from everybody. Bernard Ingram in 2002, when I was doing the assessment of Ben Tarzan wind farm in the north of Scotland, said, wind turbines do not produce energy, but they wreck the landscape. It's what the Scots deserve. Such was the view from Bernard Ingram over the northern competitor. Jessica Dalgleish in the same newspaper was quoted as, I see a wind farm from my window. I think they look like angels. So that sums up to me 2 things. The different perspectives we might have as individuals and the different perspectives we may have between age groups as well, how we look at the evolution of development. Yes, we can describe it very accurately. We have got good, well-developed and tested methodologies, landscape character assessment, etc. But you do need to have proper training and build up your expertise.
Okay, taking that on board, because it is a profession, it is a structured format in which it's done. People can depart from the guidelines, as we know, but they are there to guide people. But what about this criticism? A lot of people say it's too technical. You've made it too technical, and that makes it difficult for people to be interested in it, and it makes it difficult for the public to engage. When you talk about magnitude and susceptibility and that type of terminology, often, I mean, to be fair, over tens of thousands of words.
Yeah, fair question. It's too technical to overcomplicate it? No. Starting first with, it is guidance. So you have to take that as guidance, and you have to think about what you will take from it and why you will take that from it. It is always promoted by us in the Landscape Institute that it should be proportionate. But it is definitely not a recipe. It's not a recipe where you can have a simple recipe, the quick method. You can have the average recipe and the long drawn-out method, if you like. It is requiring careful thinking and consistency and logic that people in due course who read your assessment can understand and say, yeah, that makes sense. But making sense is not enough. You can't come at it from the making sense angle. because then you are in danger of too quickly being stuck on a track. So it sets out a very systematic methodology. It asks you essentially to question yourself. Do I need these steps? How do I justify this? To come up with a judgment. And that judgment needs to be logical and needs to be understood. Clearly, as someone says, because the trees are lost, it is X, Y, or Z. There is no reasoning, then it won't be very helpful.
What about making it proportionate, though? Because I am aware, and I know that plenty of people who say these things are just too long. And the guidelines themselves actually talk about having a proportionate assessment. So how do you achieve that? Because I think most of us would take the view they're too long when we've got lots of other reports to deal with.
Well, by agreeing with your local authority or by the consenting authority what the scope should be, what could be scoped out. And that's really quite an important stage. Understanding why you want to assess and which bits you want to assess. You don't necessarily need to go through all aspects of landscape and visual impact assessment that are conceivable by development. If some aspects are not particularly relevant, for example, if cumulative effects are not particularly important for that type of development, then it should not feature perhaps at all in the assessment. In other types of work, we need to look a lot more of cumulative assessment. So agreeing with the local authority, I think, would be the key step to start that. So you don't have the risk that once the application is in, you haven't done that, you haven't done that, you haven't done that, which is not productive. But also avoids that a submission is made with so much paper that it is just overwhelming and doesn't actually help the decision-making process.
One of the things, we had a chat earlier, and one of the things I was really impressed with, and I've seen this, is when you talk about members of the Landscape Institute having the competence and the confidence to write less. You know, it's the Oscar Wilde phrase, isn't it? I haven't got time, or whoever it was, I haven't got time to write you a short letter, so here's a long one. And what about that? Just having the confidence and competence to write something shorter.
Yeah, I did use that phrase, and I feel very strongly about it. I think as we gain experience, as we gain better knowledge and can talk about the subject perhaps more convincingly or more, then if you are confronted or in contact with a planning officer or your client for that matter, who says, I want this, that, and the other, you say, no, I don't think that's at all necessary because of these reasons. Or if your client says, I want you to write it so I can get planning permission. No, I will write it in a way that it will help the decision maker making an informed decision. And that may not be in your interest, Mr. or Mrs. Client, but it is my role, it's my duty to be independent. Or I might say, this is a design project. We need to spend much more time during the early phases to design out problems and to design in benefits. It's not a matter of drawing up a plan and then throwing it to the landscape architect and saying, yay or nay. It's not like that. It should not be like that, and we should resist it.
Yeah, I mean, I take it the Institute does talk to other professional bodies, including the planning inspector, about what they find helpful and what they find unhelpful. Does that take place?
We try and speak to as many agencies or people as we can. If we think we can make a contribution or ask for an opinion as a Landscape Institute, we'll try and give that. And we work with other parties. The guidelines for landscape and visual impact assessment themselves, of course, were developed with IEMA. And IEMA has got an accreditation system. You're not just a registered environmental assessor unless you get bi-yearly, I think every 3 years, assessed and evaluated. You have to prove that you can keep your quality of service up to the highest standards. I think that's something worth looking for in the Landscape Institute as well. To get to a state that you have an accredited landscape practitioner, an individual with a little kite mark above his or her head, and or accredited practices in that field, because it is quite a specialist skill.
Okay. A couple of quick questions before I hand over to the others. First of all, can we expect a Glivia 4? Is there another one on the way?
There's always another one on the way, and if we have Glivia 4, people start screaming for Glivia 5 because they have their bits not in it that they really like. We must keep an open mind, and we must be willing to ask questions. But replacing a publication such as GLVAA 3 with another formal is a costly and long process. We are continuously sending out little notes of clarification. There's just been a big list of questions and answers being published on the website in January in response to a training course a training session that was held in December and November. And we must be open-minded to it. It becomes easier, of course, because with the digital revolution, we can do things more digitally. But the book I personally don't see that happening in the near future. There are also people, for example, who ask, why is there no policy in this document? Well, the simple reason is because policy published today is out of date tomorrow. As you who have been quoting paragraphs to me that I've never heard of, well, no.
Yeah. And finally, what can we expect? If we're not getting a Glivia 4, what can we expect? What areas have you been looking at that we might get some more guidance on?
I think we will need to spend quite a bit more attention on cumulative assessment, because that's actually quite a difficult subject in the context of making planning decisions. Especially if we talk about developments which are visible interactively at great distances from each other, such as wind energy developments. And that is something we need to give guidance on, because whilst we had an idea how to do this 10 or 15 years ago, the scale of development is so much faster and greater that we constantly need to calibrate. I think that applies to all aspects of this. We constantly need to calibrate so it makes reasonable sense, is transparent, and helps a decision maker.
Okay, well, that's very good to know. I think cumulative is definitely an area where we could do with some more guidance. Now I'm going to hand over to the others. The first person, Charlie, what's your question?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Mark. Though there's under both the landscape and visual headings of Glivia, there's a passage in each section allowing experts to ascribe values to the nature of an effect. So development could be beneficial. In reality, in relation to new greenfield development, almost all landscape experts would take the view that new built on land has an adverse effect on landscape character. And if you can see it, it's an adverse visual effect. And so, and Chris Katkowski, my great sort of friend and mentor, he once said, well, if Blenheim Palace was up for planning permission now, it'd be a major adverse effect. Just as bad as pylons. And so does Glivia adequately allow for high quality design for new greenfield development to be taken into account? And might it be improved by focusing more on outcome than change?
Yes, it's a very fair question. And of course, this relates to the environmental assessment regulations first and foremost. So when you have identify an effect, the consequences of an impact, identify an effect, you have to advise, in your opinion, whether it's adverse, beneficial, or neutral. Now, that applies to any type of development. I would agree that when there are clear beneficial effects, that quite often they are still not particularly well articulated. Or in the case of, if there are landscape effects or landscape and visual effects, they can be quite difficult to articulate. The main reason for this, I think, is because there's not enough influence being in the initial phases of the development. We need to design much more before. So in the case of housing, I think you would sooner get that if you had further developed well-designed plans than, for example, planning permissions in principle. They're much more likely to be seen to be potentially adverse because you don't know what's going to happen. So the assessor might have an idea in his or her mind which is patently wrong. If you have a really well-designed development, which is widely respected as such, then it may be more difficult. And you may be feeling more confident to actually say, no, this could be a positive contribution. All, of course, in the context of how much of what do you actually need and where. Because that's important.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Paul, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Mark, you and I encountered each other for the first time on the great wind farm round robin in the north of England. And I know that you've done a huge number of wind farm inquiries north and south of the border and east and west of the English and Welsh border. And you've also done a number of hearings. So I'm interested from your experience, particularly in relation to landscape on major large-scale schemes, what provides the better scrutiny from the perspective of the landscape architect? A hearing or an inquiry?
They can both probably be giving a very good insight. And one of the inquiries I did west of the Welsh to English borders, incidentally, took 10 years to be determined.
Wow.
Hearings are good in the sense that there's a non-confrontational attitude. If the discussion is well led by the inspector or by the reporter, then he or she can really get probed to get a calm and well-articulated view from witnesses. It is a bit more difficult, of course, to test really whether the views expressed are also being able to substantiate it compared with being evidence in cross-examination. The advantage of cross-examination can be that you can really expose a weakness, I suppose, which is of interest of you advocates. But the disadvantage of it is it can appear to be very aggressive. It is, and frankly, I think it's sometimes a bit of a circus, a traveling circus around the country, which doesn't help decision making.
Wait, now, since you've taken the gloves off, let me take them back off again.
Yeah, okay.
One of the difficulties that we very often have for the same sort of landscape architects purporting to use the same document, similar methodologies, coming to dramatically different results in terms of valued landscape, non-valued landscape, moderate effect, nil effect, top of the range, bottom of the range. And unless you have some degree of scrutiny, whether in a circus vein or not, or more of a forensic approach, don't you need that scrutiny to try and resolve it?
I agree with you, Paul. That, in my view, is not acceptable. You need to have, if you had two landscape architects who are well informed, professionally independent, consistent, and have developed a number of expertise and experience, you will not find that if they have to assess the same impact. They can only be, because they'll be tested on that against their peers, and that's what matters.
I wish that was my experience, but thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's right, Paul. I think there are certain issues, but I think the way to sell it, don't you think, is that not everything in the landscape and visual impact assessment that might be in dispute needs to be cross-examined. There are some sort of specific things that you just need to know that, because when one says significant and one says minor, then as you say, Mark, something's gone wrong. And somebody's got to say, well, how did you arrive at that conclusion? I actually like cross-examining on landscape because of the objectivity that you've created. Actually, without the objectivity, it would be more difficult to cross-examine. Anyway, enough of that. Mary, you have a question.
I do. Are garden villages with 60-40 ratios of development to landscape / open space, are they flagships, as it were, for development? And should we be building more of them nationally to avoid squeezing unwanted development at the edges of cities and towns and villages, in your view?
Being honest, Mary, I can't answer that question because I don't know enough about that. But if I may interpret your question as saying, where would it be most appropriate, or how would it be most appropriate to deal with the housing need? This would, then I would say, yeah, one should ask the question: what are the relative effects of different solutions to the same question? So if the question is where do we put 100,000 homes in England, then we can answer that question in various ways. We can salami slice 10 houses off everywhere, or we can have bigger chunks in bits but distributed, or we can have one enormous tart in the middle. But if we understand the differences in solutions, then we can make an informed decision. But it's a more strategic question rather than one that you could instantly take in an LVAA, I think.
Yes.
Although we could assess. It's about spatial planning then, isn't it?
It is. And we do have a system of sustainability appraisals, which is supposed to inform plan making. And we also have a system whereby landscape capacity is assessed in a plan making world. But sometimes the connection between the landscape assessment in terms of capacity and the sustainability appraisal process is somewhat lacking. I would venture to suggest. But thank you very much, Mark.
I think that's a great question, Mary, if I may say so. And I don't think it's limited to new settlements. The South Worcestershire plan did propose that 60-40 ratio, and that helped sell the developments. We've got to find some way of selling it, and I think that ratio is a great ratio. Actually, a good local plan, that one. So, Sasha, turning to you then, your question.
Thank you very much, Chris. Mark, as you know, in the English MPPF, there is this concept of valued landscape. And frankly, I think the five of us all love it because we spend hours at inquiries arguing about it. If you could have your time again, do you like the utilisation of this concept of valued landscape in the planning system, or would you get rid of it if it was up to you?
You're asking a very specific, for me, south of the border question. Valued landscape comes from box 5.1 in GLVA, which is meant to be an illustration, an approach, not the approach, not recommended, not guided. It says quite clearly in the document that all landscapes have value, and of course there are different, dare I say, levels of value. We've clearly identified valued landscape by designation, for example. But that doesn't mean that other landscapes are not valued or do not have value. And I think it's a confusion, the linguistic separation between valued landscape and value of landscape to people. It's quite subtle for me. Let's take it north of the border. We've got areas of wild land. They are subject to more scrutiny than landscape within national scenic areas or national parks, even potentially. And yet they're not designated and protected in the same sense. And it's, again, a really difficult subject area to get to above the waterline so that we can all have a common understanding of it. And perhaps the best way forward in terms of this issue is to have a debate within the profession and try and articulate out what valued landscapes might be and landscape value. Like there has been a debate about sensitivity assessments. We have now got an English, a Welsh and a Scottish approach to identifying landscape sensitivity, not the same as capacity, certainly not the opposite of it. And that is very helpful to have a lot of the terminology agreed and the methodology agreed. And I think the similar thing might help landscape value and valued landscapes.
Thank you, Sasha. We've had lots and lots of questions. We picked up that, I think, pretty much in the theme of everything that we've asked. Just one technical question. Now, Wendy Lancaster, one of your members, asking about your feelings about technical note 6 of 19 and the over-complication in the presentation of photographs. That guidance is designed to make it easier to present photographs. Is that right?
Guidance note TGN 619, it's been the subject of a lot of interest. What the purpose of the guidance note is to set out again a recommended or a guidance way forward in terms of dealing with photographic illustrations in support of plan application. Now, this field has developed incredibly fast. I did the landscape and visual impact assessment of the Cairngorm funicular not national park then, but now in the national park. There was an artist who drew the proposal on transparency on a photograph, and that was copied as the photo illustration. That was acceptable at that time. We now have the ability to create models and visualizations which are accurate to up 5 centimeters. We cannot apply the same method to all cases. That level of accuracy may be required occasionally. For most situations, I don't think it's required in that same level. But we must improve and continue to improve our standards in that. And we can do by giving guidance, and that's what that document seems to do. It's not prescriptive. Some people find that difficult. It's not prescriptive. Others find it necessary not to be prescriptive because it would force every landscape architect to do the same thing. And it's not necessary. It's not proportionate, not necessarily proportionate.
Well, that's really interesting. I have to say, I think the quality of models and illustrative materials is improving all the time, the 3D models and the physical models, and that has to make for better decision making. Mark, thank you ever so much. I didn't ask you a single... Go on.
So I wanted to ask one quick thing. There's a lot of emphasis on the printed material for photovoltaic. Of course, inspectors, reporters don't look at printed material anymore. We look at our screens. And this changed the ball game of visualizations again, I think.
That's a very fair point. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. We're very grateful to you. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks from me too, Mark. Really informative and fascinating in discussion, indeed. Can I remind everybody, please, to consider making a donation to the Neurodegeneration Research Fund for the University of Dundee. Rob's put the link on in the chat, filling in the top, and I said it'll be on our website too. We're back on the 7th of July, and for the first time, we've got a local authority council leader, Toby Savage, the leader of South Gloucestershire Council, which has had quite a heavy in tray in planning related matters over the last year or so. So Toby's going to be joining us. We're looking forward to welcoming him on the 7th of July. In the meantime, have a wonderful fortnight. Hope you manage to bear up with the warm weather. Enjoy your gig, Chris, on Saturday. I'm off to see the Stones in Hyde Park myself, which will be good. Thank you again, Mark, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much.